We're going into our fourth session today titled Technology and Administrative Reform, Experience from India and the World. The session will dwell on the challenges emerging from the digitization of goods and services delivery and ask how technology can be leveraged to bring in much needed reforms in the welfare bureaucracy. We have, again, an exciting lineup of panelists to talk through these issues. The panel will be moderated by Yamini Iyer, who's President CPR, and let me ask Yamini to come up, say a few words, and then invite the panelists on board.
Thank you, Mukta. For those of you who've been here with us since the morning, all you brave souls, and also, I must add, all you now very enlightened souls, you may recall I said in the morning that one of the most critical issues that we as a policy research institution, as an institution that has been engaging with the challenge of policy making and the challenge of policy implementation, have confronted quite repeatedly is the issue of the capacity and the capability of the Indian state itself. It is fairly common in our imagination of the Indian state to picture it and perhaps that is the reality of a state that is peopled with a lot of actors, most of whom show up to work but rarely, are relatively incompetent, but very competent when it comes to bribing. And we pride ourselves in a Babu culture and in a very, very solid and robust administrative services, but it's very commonplace to argue that as good as India is on the top, something about the top's ability to translate its ideas into action starts failing and flailing. And no matter which area of work that the center has engaged with, whether it is foreign policy, as we began today's deliberations with, or the challenges of the 21st century, when we spoke about jobs and technology, and we will in the next session be talking about technology, artificial intelligence, and law and regulation. But also, as we discussed in the previous session, the problems of agriculture, the problems of sanitation, the problems of human capital, we always hit upon this question about whether the Indian state is in fact designed, capacitated, and indeed capable of being responsive to the demands that are being placed on it and to be able to meet the aspirations of all Indians. And it was with that in mind that we chose to pull together lots of different aspects of what CPR was doing and build out a new initiative on state capacity. We'll be formally launching and talking a lot more about the initiative later this evening, but what we offer in this session is an important taster to the challenge of state capacity and the challenge of administrative reforms. I remember a good 15 or 16 years ago, traveling around rural India, working at the time as I was on the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. It was then called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, with another colleague who didn't live in India but was studying anti-poverty programs. And as we went from village to village, from panchayat office to panchayat office, from block office to block office, and ended up in the state headquarters, we were at every step of the way confronted with new innovations and new technologies that were slowly being introduced into the implementation of NREGA. Smart cards, at that point there were no biometrics yet. There were smart cards, there were MIS systems, there was new video conferencing, cameras everywhere, new forms of data collection. There were new actors in block offices. Suddenly you saw a big change from the safari suit to the jean pant professional in the block office, and the jean pant professional was usually someone that had been contracted in from the private sector to do data entry. Many of them were sitting in small little rooms without even a window, with piles and piles of files that they were slowly putting in to the computer. Computerization was becoming the new thing. And as we looked at all of this, my colleague turned to me and said, I think India is entering the era of e-Raj. And that really, I think, summarized one of the most important and critical moments of transformation that Indian administration has gone through over the last decade to decade and a half. It is commonplace in our imaginations to think of the Indian administration as that old, archaic, colonial structure that has been stubborn in its refusal to become 21st century. But the reality of Indian administration is truly very different. It is far more 21st century than most of us sitting in this room are even able to imagine. There is not an acronym out there that doesn't link back to a mobile app, to a management information system, to a new biometric card, to a new database that is coming in to make administration look, feel, and in fact perform very differently. So much so that it's almost become the magic bullet. When all things fail, at least we have technology to bypass the state, to work through the state, to rid us of the inefficiencies and the corruptions of the state. But how effective can technology be? How effective is this e-Raj when there still are very real elements of the old Raj that dominate the everyday functioning of our bureaucracy? This is one of the most fundamental questions that we need to ask ourselves when we think about administrative reforms and state capacity. Most people in this room have traveled all over the world, I'm sure, and most of you have done what I've done, which is show up in the United States with your laptop charger that is still linked to the India plug, and then you take it and you hope to God that it'll just work. So you take the wrong plug and you're trying desperately to shove it into the right socket or a different socket in the hope that miraculously your computer will start working. I often, in my experience of the relationship between technology and the Indian administration, think of it like this. And it is to explore some of these issues that we have brought together some of the most important practitioners and thinkers and researchers that have been engaging with this issue, not only transforming our technologies and bringing Indian administration into the 21st century, but also pushing the older parts of the Indian administration into becoming more attuned to the technology so that it can achieve its potential, and others who are working to understand the impacts of this technology, who also bring in a certain degree of skepticism into the new changes and critiques into the new changes in order that we can ensure that the future of India's administration is truly robust and genuinely 21st century in a way that effectively ensures that every citizen receives benefits that are given to them in their name. So may I invite first Dr. Saurabh Garg, who of course many of you are familiar with from all his great work and from the last session. He is the Principal Secretary of Agriculture from the government of Odisha. We also have with us Ms. Shrayana Bhattacharya, who's been a partner in crime with me in many of our work on technology, actually on the Indian welfare state more broadly, but also looking at technology, who is a senior economist at the World Bank. Mr. Varad Pandey, who is currently investment partner at the Omidyar Network. But Varad has also been a long-time partner in many crimes, but including in his experience working with the Ministry of Rural Development, which was, I think, some of the early phase of the e-Raj that was building up can be attributed to a lot of the thinking and work that Varad and his colleagues did at the time. And Mr. Arun Sharma, who's here, oh wonderful, who's been leading India's work on the direct benefit transfers at the Government of India. May I invite all of you to the stage so we could begin the conversation. While they come, I also wanted to say that this panel is being organized in partnership with the World Bank. Much of the work that we are doing at CPR as part of our thinking on administrative reforms, specifically on the elements of technology, we have a few projects together. And so it is the sort of next step forward in that partnership that brings this panel discussion together. So thank you. Thank you. So let me start by asking you, Dr. Garg, to just reflect a little bit on this evolution of the e-Raj, at least as we have, as outsiders to the bureaucracy, but close observers of the bureaucracy have characterized this. How do you see the role and relationship of technology as it evolved in administration? And from your vantage point, do you really consider this as a magic bullet? You have the...
Oh, okay. Yeah, I hope we can So yes, I mean if you look at the last decades, if one can just go back a bit, uh, the first was obviously the introduction of the mobile phones, which in itself led to a sea change in terms of the communication, and that itself led to a lot of efficiencies that came in. This was followed by the desktop computers, and then you had all this e-Raj, as you mentioned. And of course, that was followed by laptops, tablets, smartphones. And in the increasingly over the past few years, you have the use of remote sensing for example, for agriculture. You have the use of data analytics, which can look at large volumes of data and try and pull in. And then you have the linkage or the development of the Aadhaar and the core banking system, which ensured that banks got linked, and then you had the Jandan Aadhaar mobile Trinity, as it is called. So there's been a sea change in terms of delivery of services, the way delivery, and there's been also a lot of change within the government in the way government processes have worked. For example, I can just give the example of Orissa. In Orissa now we don't have those thick files with the red tape tied around it. So literally we've done away with the red tape, so to say, and you have electronic files now. You don't have, so the files can move from a section officer to me to the chief minister and back within 1 hour up and down. Otherwise, earlier it was the peon would decide when he felt good enough to pick up the file from one desk and walk across to the other desk and put it out there. So it's been a lot of disempowerment also for a lot of people, but it's also mean that the speed of decision making has improved. And you can really expand this in whichever field. And I think the social media, the WhatsApp and the Facebooks, etc., apart from ensuring that you can have direct communication and direct message spreading, also we have, for example, in the agriculture sector, which would be there in each panchayat, we have a group of 100 farmers with a village agriculture worker on one WhatsApp group. So we have 7,000 panchayats and 100 leading farmers of each panchayat on the WhatsApp group with the village agriculture worker. Then you have at the block level all the block agriculture officer with all the field level officials and Krishak Sathis and so on to the state level. So one has started using a lot of these kind of quick communication and sending out messages. We have, for example, IVRS voice. We have 7 lakh farmers on our system, and whenever there's any calamity or any expected pest infestation, so we can send messages, pre-recorded voice messages or text messages to people. I'm not saying necessarily all of them have smartphones, so a pre-recorded voice message is what goes across. So I can multiply this remote sensing in insurance and linking with credit, etc. I'll not get into too many details, but I think there's been a sea change in how fast decision making has occurred and how delivery of services can be done in a number of areas.
Mr. Sharma, can I turn to you? Dr. Garg has painted a very exciting picture of the foundations of e-Raj across all different kinds of technologies that are coming together to hasten decision making. But from your experience of building the DBT platform and merging what I think is now more than 500 schemes, placing them onto the platform, it couldn't have been easy. Dr. Garg makes it sound like we just had to get the E in there and it all moved. And I know that's not what you meant. But tell us a little bit about the challenge. What does it actually take to bring technology into a process? And what are some of the challenges?
Sure. Thanks,
Anand. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks, Yamini. I obviously echo Dr. Garg's observations that he made. And yes, it's not easy to bring all that sir has just described into the building, into the platforms. Governments are typically last to bring technology in its practice, in their practices. Be it in regulations that we bring out or when you're actually using that technology, when it has proved itself, that's when governments actually start using it and bring out the standards. This is true for this case also, except for 2 or 3 things which are different. The first is the digital identity platform that Sarit mentioned, which is Aadhaar, which is kind of unprecedented in terms of the scale, in terms of the number of transactions, and the sheer volume that we possess, and everything around it, the legal structures, the regulatory structures, which are still, it was the second largest heard case in the Supreme Court, and there are some petitions still pending. So that's one separate aspect. Then, of course, you have the banking systems where monies are being transferred to close to about 120 crore bank accounts that we have in the country. 37 crore of them they were opened in the Jan Dhan drive, of which about 29 crore are still active. So these two are the first and the last leg. The second leg, DBT, I would say, is built on 3 large platforms, or 3 pillars. The first is the digital ID, the third is the banking technology. The second is where all the complexities are, and what you were describing as the e-Raj. We are currently at about 400 plus schemes. Now, each of these schemes, if you take about 10-15 super schemes, your Pehel, Narega, PDS, fertilizer, these are super schemes in terms of the number of subscribers, the sheer amount of money that is transferred. PDS is 1,50,000 crore per year. Fertilizer was 85,000 crore as of last year. Now, to implement them, since you asked, what does it take? From people sitting in Delhi at the highest level, down to the functionary who's there at the village level, they all need to be speaking the same language. That's the first sort of tenet on which these principles are to be built. So they have to have the same understanding. When we say that Aadhaar can be taken as an ID, but it is not mandatory, then that same understanding has to be there. The data, the way it is to be stored, of course, we lay down the policies and the structures around it, but where it is being stored, where the data entry is being done, whether that person understands it, is aware of the legal connotations of what he's doing, that's the complexity. The understanding obviously differs. Technology is a great enabler, but the benefits of technology are not distributed uniformly. I think that's a fairly simple observation if you see in your practice in any field. And that's what we grapple with, that's what we try to avoid. Because as we go down into the field, into the brass tacks of the implementation process, the differences start arriving, and we get into trouble, or the questions that are asked are at the cutting edge, where there is a difference of understanding, implementation, opinion, and so on and so forth. So to put everything together under one sort of rules, one sort of standard that everybody follows it, it's a difficult task. And given the size of our country, if you take, there's no database, or there cannot be a database as of now, where we have a unique number of beneficiaries across all schemes. So we have non-unique beneficiaries. So I can tell you how many beneficiaries are there in Pehel, which is the LPG subsidy, or in Narega. These are unique beneficiaries, but I can't tell you, there's no way to mine that particular data on how many of these beneficiaries are drawing the same benefits across all schemes. So if you put them all together, it's at about 143 crore. So you have 143 crore beneficiary records in multiple data sets, which are to be treated the same way. We have a data privacy bill, which is to be made a law. But apart from that, Aadhaar is the governing law of the land. And within that, to make sure that this is all going as smoothly, because the number of pings that the CIDR, the UIDI's central data repository, is hit to authenticate an individual, that is where the complexities are. And where we are, so I mentioned the JAM Trinity, which has been the driving force of this entire initiative. Now we've got the Jan Dhan part, we've got the Aadhaar part. The mobile part is still weak. Because we don't have services that are oriented for delivery at the beneficiary level. not too many services are being delivered or can be delivered at the moment, nor the beneficiary can actually make an application using a mobile phone. And there are various reasons for it. Typically, governments don't think or didn't think that the beneficiary has the agency to make that process himself or herself. What we assume is the assisted model works, that if you help the beneficiary, it's better, but that's something that we are taking up now. And once that is put into the hands of the beneficiary, I think we'll see more and more inclusive economy, inclusive governance process coming into picture.
So let me just ask you, Dr. Garg, one, just listening to what Mr. Sharma was saying, 400 schemes.
Yeah.
Isn't that where the problem begins? And I would ask you to reflect on ends. What is it that makes the system so complex that then we need to put technology systems in to streamline them?
You're right. In fact, if I can just mention that when we were developing the Kalia database about a year back, we looked at different farmer schemes, and we had some 15, 20 of them alone. And we had problems like issues like some schemes had 10 data points, another had 20. Some were stored on a simple DBMS or even an Excel sheet. Some were on MySQL, some were on MS SQL. Some were in let's say mainframe computers, some were on someone's laptops. The authority who had access to the data varied. And then when you try and copy an Excel sheet into a MySQL, there are data losses. You have bank accounts of some banks which have 15 digits, some have 13 digits, some have only numeric, some have alphanumeric, some have alphabets in the beginning, some have it at the end, and all these. And then you are trying to get a synthesized database which is unique, and you should be in a position to identify the same person, or in our case, we wanted not more than one person from one family. So what's the definition of a family? Is it the ration card? But then how do you match the ration card to the SECC, the socio-economic caste data, where you don't have a common link, because Aadhaar in some cases was 50% Aadhaar seeded, in some others were not. So I think the complexities in actually moving to a database which is sanitized and refined and which really identifies your target, it's a complex job. But the fact remains that technology now aids you into that. I mean, artificial intelligence sounds very high tech, but I mean, we have used that just to the fuzzy logic. So supposing in India, if someone is named as Sahu, you can write it as S-A-H-U or S-A-H-O-O, and Ram can be R-A-M, it can be R-A-M-A, and all these. And if you do a match between the name, Aadhaar name, and yours, it will say if it's R-A-M and R-A-M-A, there's no match. So you need to use fuzzy logic and move ahead. So it's not easy, but I think technology now exists to do that. And I think that's the reason why we've come so far in DBT, PM Kisan, Kalia, and all these schemes from what it was.
Shreyana, let me turn to you. One of the things that we've heard from both Dr. Garg and Mr. Sharma is how complex this actually is. And when you just look at the Indian state across all levels, but particularly at the grassroots, one of the things that strikes you is how thin it actually is. Vacancy rates are phenomenally high across multiple levels. Every time we have interacted with panchayat level officers or block level officers, you've been with me in some of those conversations as well, you always hear things can't get done because we don't have people. And now we have all these these technologies that are ostensibly here to help and aid us, but where are the people who are going to do all of these very complicated things? I'm very curious to know how Orissa found the people, but every time I have seen a new innovation being introduced into government, particularly at the grassroots, you find that the only way it works is if the entire bureaucracy gets mobilized around that one task, and that can't possibly be a sustainable way of doing things. So what are your observations, both in terms of the thinness of the state and how that is aiding or abetting the technology transformation, but are there also lessons to be learned from other parts of the world?
Thanks, Yamini. Before I react, I just thought it would be helpful to give everyone some perspective on where my interventions are coming from. So for the past 7 or 8 years, I've been part of a team at the World Bank that's been supporting the DBT mission, the Ministry of Rural Development, several state governments, including Odisha, in strengthening welfare programs. And unsurprisingly, over the past decade, we've seen technology has become a key principle and architect in strengthening these measures. And what's interesting is I never thought that the kinds of conversations I find myself in about APIs and with engineers and technologists would be the kind of career choice that I would make, because originally when I would work on welfare programs, my imagination of that work was very different. And so I'm bringing, I think, perspectives from consulting firms, engineers, local bureaucracy, as you were mentioning, as well as state governments when I respond. Look, I think we all know, given the thinness of the state, and I think I hear this in what Mr. Sharma was saying and what Dr. Garg is saying as well, technology is only a tool. It's an enabler. It's not a talisman. The effectiveness of technology cannot be divorced from the socio-political environment in which it's designed, deployed, and developed. And what I mean by that is if you look at the way we think and characterize the use of technology in the Indian state, it's very much around discipline. It's very much around leakage. So if you think about what is the problem that technology is often deployed to use at scale, it's to try and reduce expenditure inefficiencies through cutting leakages in some way or form. I would argue, looking at where the Indian welfare state is, particularly the social protection system, and in that we're looking specifically at cash transfer schemes, compared to other middle income countries, be it a Brazil or an Indonesia or a Turkey, what you find is that leakages are only a very narrow symptom of a much broader architectural problem. And what I mean by that, and you'll see that technology is only a part of a solution to that. So one problem was what you mentioned as an example of fragmentation. I think currently we have 434 direct benefit transfer schemes. A state like Odisha where we work, there are 97 state schemes as well. In a state like Kerala, at the panchayat level, you will have additional schemes. So the volume of these schemes, and imagine each one is doing its own delivery chain and its own program life cycle, be it payments, be it middle management, be it deciding who receives what benefit, completely in silos without being able to leverage what the other is doing. And what that's constructed is, I think, partly is exacerbated by the thinness of the state, because you have at the local level a Gram Rozgar Sevak or one person in the panchayat who is often expected to actually be the face of all these multiple schemes when it comes to the way they interact with citizens, right? Now, technology allows for a solution to that. So the DBT platform, for example, is an interesting case where at least you can start to consolidate payment platforms for, or at least the 435, you can use one as opposed to having multiple splintered areas. But the problem is, even there, what we find is the terms of what I think Arun was saying, the terms of a shared understanding, the time and talent that it takes to actually link the bank account information. This sounds very simple and rudimentary, but it's extremely hard to do in the field. Linking bank account information with the right person, making sure that exclusion does not occur, making sure if people don't receive payments, there is a point of contact where they can go and actually address grievances at. These are extremely complex phenomena. And without thinking through the terms of collaboration, the business process rules, and the purpose to which technology is being used as a method of collaboration, you will end up only perhaps orthogonally tackling the leakage problem, but not broader problems of the state. I'll give you just one last example, and I'll leave it there, which is one of the other things we know is with this increasing use of technology for multiple social welfare programs, the erstwhile power asymmetries for programs has radically changed. So earlier, what you had was a citizen who was entitled to a particular benefit, and there would be someone at the local bureaucracy who had power and discretion. So it could be your BDO, it could be the district magistrate, or someone even much more local at the panchayat level. What's happened now with the increasing use of point of sale devices, computers, when you go into the state is, as you were saying, is often someone with jeans and pants and is a computer operator. Now, I remember once being in the field in Jharkhand and somebody said to me, well, if my local fair price shop stops giving me grains or diverts grains, I can go and scream and yell at the local politician. So there is some kind of citizen voice there. But if your point of sale device stops working, or the cloud is not working, or the internet fails you, what is the mechanism to address this new power asymmetry between those who are designing technology and those who are experiencing it?
So Bharat, actually, just drawing from what we've heard so far, there is obviously a structural governance problem across, all these multiple silos, the old red tape, the files with the lal fatta, and all of which technology is being deployed to try and remove, engage with, at least leapfrog. We can't get rid of the 400 schemes, but we can leapfrog the 400 schemes by streamlining the delivery system. We've talked a lot about the system. Shreyana began to push us in the direction of thinking a little bit harder about the citizen. Ultimately, all of this is meant to aid and benefit citizens. Can we bring you in to talk a little bit about technology and the citizen, and what technology is doing or not doing for the citizen?
Yeah. So firstly, thanks for having us, and thank you for CPR Dialogues. I think CPR is a rare organization which tries to bring so many of these issues relevant to India at one stage. So congratulations to you and your colleagues. And just to start by saying that I think both personally and the organization that I represent are big believers in the power of technology for social impact. I think the fact that it opens up all these opportunities for people's aspirations, the fact that it can hold up citizens, empower citizens to hold governments to account, all of that stuff. But equally, I think the recognition that where you started out, that it's not a silver bullet. And increasingly, a lot of our work is now focused on thinking about what we call responsible tech, which is how do you overcome the harms of tech in its various dimensions. There are a set of harms around exclusion that I think a lot of people in this room are familiar with. We support something called the State of Aadhaar report, which actually was launched in this room a few months back, which really tries to answer the question of the level of exclusion and types of exclusion that Aadhaar may have caused and how that may be changing over time, and so on. But also increasingly questions of data privacy, data that are becoming increasingly relevant as large amounts of citizen and resident data is being collected for social good purposes by governments, by technology companies, and so on and so forth. So I think on that there is sort of violent agreement here. I think the one aspect I would like to add to this discussion is I think there's sort of a paradigm shift happening in the way GovTech is being thought about, and I think we are at the cusp of a major change, which I wanted to talk about. See, the first phase of GovTech was essentially about the computerization that Dr. Garg talked about, which is taking offline processes, making them online, right? Sort of. Then there was, I think, a second stage, which was really about, let's think of end-to-end systems, where you are trying to think from first principles, but building a vertical system that a department or a ministry is trying to build to serve its own purpose. But I think now we are at the cusp of a change where increasingly there's this whole move to what we are calling sort of open ecosystems, which is really the fact that governments should not necessarily think about building large monolithic systems in their departments, but trying to build the minimal architecture that they need for their needs, and then creating the pipes that connect to other government departments and other innovators, more broadly speaking. So, the idea that when you do government procurement, you're not trying to give a 5 to 10 year, multi-year, highly complex systems contract, but trying to build a minimal system that can serve your needs and piggyback on everything else that already exists. And this has multiple advantages. One, of course, is the fact that you don't have to build everything from scratch. You can use the building blocks that are already in place, so it reduces the cost. It also allows you to connect to the other systems. So every department needs data, information, partnerships with others. So if you have what is now called open API type architecture, you can create these kind of systems which talk to each other. And also if you architect it well, you can also open it up to innovators to build applications on top. So if there's a bunch of interesting organizations now thinking of how can you create apps that allow citizens to firstly figure out what are they entitled to, and then holding their representatives to account. So if you have what you call a system with open APIs, you can have a sort of a startup building an app that allows you to see if I'm the person with these characteristics, what are the 5 government schemes out of the 434 that I'm today eligible for, and then ask for it and pressurize my member of parliament and my BDO, etc., to actually make that happen. So I think that's one important thing, but I think the one thing to keep in mind, this is a very technical conversation, and I think one of the realizations we've had is that when you think of building tech systems, think of the non-tech layers first. And I think there are 2 aspects to that. Aspect number 1 is to think of the user that you are trying to build for, and you need to think of that last mile person who is going to actually use the app that is going to provide the service, the guy with the jeans that you were talking about. You need to think of the last mile citizen who may not have any clue on how to use a smartphone, and now you're asking him or her to sort of engage with government on that mode. And you need to think about entrepreneurs and others who you are expecting will come and build stuff on that. So first of all, I think getting the user front and center before you design the tech is very important. And I think the second non-tech element is thinking about the governance of that piece, which is again thinking about who will be accountable for this system, what will be the right institutional home, what would be the rules around data sharing and data access that will govern this government system. And I think only if you have a good hypothesis and a sort of good thinking is when you should start thinking about the tech specs and the RFP, etc., for this system. So I think that fundamental shift number 1 from building systems to actually building minimal platforms on which others can collaborate. And second, thinking of the non-tech pieces, the user experience and the governance before you even start building the tech are the 2 big changes that are needed.
Thanks, Bharat. We've been very polite, so I'm now going to start getting provocative. Very often when I hear conversations about technology and administrative reforms or technology and bureaucracy, and I think we've seen threads of this coming through in this conversation as well, it often makes me think about whether we are actually fundamentally rethinking the social contract in the following way, that we are saying that government can do a certain set of things. We'll use technology to try and do those a little better. But if you want us to be genuinely efficient to citizens, it will come at some cost. The trade-off is perhaps your privacy, because even the Supreme Court has said whatever one may engage with on Aadhaar and the concerns of privacy, that's to save people like me who use credit cards. But if you want government welfare, that's the trade-off you have to make. So we are trading off to a degree on privacy, but that trade-off is also embedded in a notion that at the last mile, the officer or your encounter with the state minus technology is likely always to be slightly dodgy. Okay, because I'm not going to be able to give you that honest officer. I'm going to be able to discipline the officer into behaving better with use of technology, but I'm not going to create an ethical system in your engagement with the state where first point is to behave, second point is to be disciplined into behaving. And also, by the way, I'm saying the same of you, citizen, too, because very often you take the same name and you come back again and again and try to get the same bag of rice in the name of the poor. So in some senses, we are sort of saying the encounter between the citizen and the state is actually going to be determined on the basis of neither can the citizen trust the state nor can the state trust the citizen. Therefore, we will use technology to try and get everybody to start behaving. Is that a fair characterization? Because it does fundamentally change how citizen-state relations are framed.
I would put it this way, that whenever you're going from one steady state to another steady state, it's an iterative process. And in this iterative process, I think one is using technology to move to a higher level of trust, and in order to move there, there has to be some means of check and correction. And that check and correction is being done through the use of technology. And let me give one or two examples. In Orissa, for example, we've started this program called Mo Sarkar, which is that if anyone goes to a government office, he or she gives their mobile number and goes for a service. And within a few days, and that mobile number then goes into that so-and-so person came for this service, and there will be a phone call to that citizen asking only on one question: how was the behavior of not whether the service was, whether the grievance or the service was achieved, but what was the behavior of that person, and number two, did that person ask you for money? Only on these 2 points, nothing else. And I think the fact that both the citizen and the government provider knows that this question would be asked, and obviously you can't do it for 100%, so it would be on a sample basis, but you will get there. So this is what will increase the trust between over time. We are hopeful that this will, number one, make the government servant at the cutting edge to be more polite and hopefully not ask for a bribe. And secondly, the citizen also asks for a service which he or she knows that either they are entitled for or that they can get. Another example, if I can give, we've started this at the village agriculture worker. We always had this feedback that they're not available for the farmer when they want. So we've said that every Monday from 12 to 2, the village agriculture worker would be available in the GP office. Now, how to ensure that the person is there? He just has to stand in front of the office, click a snap, and upload it onto an app that the person has at 12 o'clock and at 2 o'clock. Whether he did anything out there, we're not asking that, because that depends on whether the farmer comes, but I think that's the first step. We will come to that. The second step would be that what did you do, what were the farmer's questions, and what are the areas. But I think the fact that you can use technology to be able to move to a different level of a steady state does not mean that there is lack of trust, but I think it means that you realize that the present system needs improvement, and you can use technology to move to that improvement. And I would just like to add one other thing. I think we've moved from a stage from, I mean, the mobile is now going to be the ubiquitous mode of what should I say, communication, delivery, laptop, etc. All you don't need that. The mobile is there, and the mobile app makes it what should I say, immaterial for the village level worker to be a technology wizard. That person, all they need is to how to open an app, and given that more than nearly 70% of the phones are already smartphones, and with the field level person, we are ensuring that they have smartphones, that as long as that ground level person has a smartphone and can open an app, that is all the level of technology sophistication that they need. They don't need to know how that information gathers out there. And I think that itself, I think since that was one of the issues that was mentioned, that whether you need that level of technology sophistication, I don't think it's required.
Could I come in? Because I think you mentioned two of my favorite topics, data privacy and trust. I think to answer your question clearly, I don't think the citizen or the resident should be asked to make that choice of having to give up his or her data privacy because there's something nice which is being offered at the end of the thing. I think there is a belief that people are more than willing to sort of, give up their data for, a slice of pizza or a samosa to put it, for all their data for that purpose. I think that's not correct. I think there is, and there's been some research done on this over the last 2 years that, underlying some of this is a sort of a growing sense of unease around what is happening to my data. I think the fact that people, people do sign consent forms, like all of us do, when we sign up to apps, and when we even the form you made us sign, you just made us sign before this panel. But I think there is a growing subliminal concern and fear around this topic. I think we all know the dangers of this. I think we all are aware of the famous Cambridge Analytica story a few years ago. Why should we look that far? We know, last week when the incidents in Delhi happened, there was a news story allegedly that people had looked at the car plate numbers of people from the transport department to identify people who they wanted to go after. I don't know how correct that story is, but even the prospect that something like that is today even possible is worrying. I think unfortunately we don't have any clear answers on how to find that balance, but I think we have some clues. We have some clues on how to design the data sharing norms. I think the idea that consent will solve all the problems is now, it's increasingly recognized is not true. Consent is never going to be enough. We need to have what is called privacy by design in the technology itself. And that's a longer discussion which we can have on what that means, but I think that is really a fundamental question we need to solve for. The other thing is, since you mentioned the broader trust question, I think there's also a broader question on how do we get people engaged and trusting technology more broadly speaking. And just to give you an example on an experiment that we have recently funded on this trust of the common person with technology, we are actually funding a radio show which is called Zindagi Mobile, which comes on Big FM. I don't know if some of you have heard it. It comes in 58 markets across the country through January to March, where essentially a radio storyteller called Nilesh Mishra, who is quite a popular radio storyteller, he has 34 million listeners every week to his radio show. He is telling a 7.5-minute story, which is an entertaining story, but embedded in that story is a message around the importance of data privacy. It could be things like, don't share your password when somebody calls you, or don't leave your phone unattended without password, etc. But it's not a public service message. It is something which sort of happens to be embedded in the story. And so it's a little experiment to see whether these kind of things can help build greater both comfort and trust in issues that are becoming increasingly important, especially for first-time mobile phone and smartphone users. And I think we need a lot more of this kind of creative thinking if we want to build trust in digital.
Sure. Just, Trina, I know you want to come in here, but I wanted to pose one more question to both you and Mr. Sharma, which I think as you respond to this issue, because they are interlinked, which is the following. I see also in this whole question of social contract, trust, building new frameworks, another tension, which is that on the one hand, there is an expectation in that citizens now have vis-a-vis the government, that it will be a much more engaged government. We spoke about social media. So much of social media is about government becoming more engaged with people. I mean, all of you are now on Twitter, and the old rule of bureaucrats, being behind the scenes, quietly doing their work is now shifting, because their expectation is that bureaucrats actually have to actively engage with citizens that they serve and be much, much more visible. There is also in all the traditional roles of what government is supposed to do, whether it's health or education or sanitation, it is supposed to be participatory, it is supposed to be engaged, it is supposed to be deliberative. And you're also imposing technology, which is actually taking the state away and putting it into the hands of the data entry operator and the DBT platform and so on. So how do these two tensions actually play themselves out? And again, I think in all this conversation, we've talked relatively less about the citizen and a lot more about the app. So I just wanted some reflections from both of you, and actually all four of you on this as well.
Yamini, let me start by saying, I think there's somewhere this belief that technology will help us not have some very hard conversations around the way the welfare state is architected. And what I mean by that is three elements of this, which in fact, body of literature, be it from impact evaluations, process evaluations, tell us, while you can use tech for immediate increases in certain outcomes, to embed and sustain that practice over long periods of time is a fundamentally political, normative, and participatory issue. And that immediately goes to the question of, is the local state currently capable to engage in these deliberative practices? So take one example, and you've been part of this exercise with me. There's the Socio-Economic Census, which is increasingly being used to target large national programs. And it's extremely exciting and important initiative, because what it does is, as opposed to these individual 435 programs deciding who's eligible and who's neediest, it contains data on certain attributes correlated with wealth, which are proxy means tested, and helps identify some rank or score of who should be receiving benefits. The problem in a country like India, where nearly 50% of the population is clustered around the poverty line, is that everybody's scores nearly come out to be the same. And what happens then is you have a Gram Rozgar Sevak and a Panchayat at the local level who is asked to make decisions around prioritization, do so in a fair, participatory manner without having the right skills to manage conflict at the local level, to have that discern at the local level, to be able to use even authority to respond or even update the information in some cases, right? So having a tech tool or using platforms such as using the Socio-Economic Census or the DBT is not going to make questions around how do you architect the local state, the investments in the local state. I think you talked about vacancies. There's a study I saw by EPOD which shows that I think in Madhya Pradesh for Narega, there are large numbers of computer operators that these positions continue to be vacant. And unless and until you start to tackle those problems, technology is not going to bypass those issues. Another issue here is what is the terms of collaboration across government? And what I mean by that is, for example, these 435 programs, if we acknowledge that this is far too fragmented a system and we want more coordination, how do you make sure that people within government, especially middle management level at the local level, are willing to participate in this conversation for collaboration? Because everybody wants to retain control, and I think these are very typical agent incentive problems. How do you start to make sure that technology is used to create a culture of collaboration as opposed to a culture right now of leakages, control, and discipline? And I don't think technology obfuscates those very tough questions. And you see now Niti Aayog, I believe, they've set up a committee to think about integrated social protection programs. And so it's great that those are the spaces where these really tough conversations need to occur, which then can inform the design principles of technology. But as Bharat was saying, you can't just first issue the RFP, build the system, and then hope that it'll adapt to some use case. You have to be very clear-eyed about what is the purpose of the tool that is being created and what is the power context and the larger context in which it's going to be deployed. And that requires tough intergovernmental conversations about how monies move, how people are trained, people are recruited, rewarded. Technology can can enable those processes, but it can't answer those questions.
I mean, I'd stopped my last comments, I'd stopped by saying that the jam trinity, why we haven't gotten to the delivery by mobile or application by mobile is because of this very fact that till now in our thinking, we had assumed that the beneficiary has no agency. And hence that kind of limits the applicability of the technology, bringing it to into his or her domain. Now we're trying to change that. So enabling, and again, to take it further, trust is again a two-way process. Whether the beneficiary has the trust in himself or herself to use that particular technology. You need the person, you need the data entry operator or the jeans wala guy that you mentioned. Because if you were to open all of these systems to the particular beneficiary, whether they'll be able to use it. You spoke about privacy by design. How many people would actually understand it? How many people would actually understand the concept of privacy where, even the court has upheld proportionality, what you were describing. That's the principle of proportionality, that you give up your privacy for a benefit. But again, it has to be proportional, it has to be limited. There's a reciprocity element also that is involved. We've had one round of, one churn of these larger discussions. I mean, the history is about 10 years of our personal data, of our personal, and whatever we are discussing here, it's all in this context. Going forward, we'll need another fine-tuning of these principles that we've come about in the public discourse on how we design governance, how we design technology enabling governance, and some of it has to be discussed. Varad had mentioned shared platforms. There are challenges in that. Why we haven't been able to do it? You asked why do we need 400 schemes? The way our laws are built right now, I need a separate database for each of these because the biggest concern that the court had was if I can, take someone and get all their data, and so that risk is there. Whether for me, it's very efficient to have one person and see this guy gets XYZ benefits, monitor those and see that in the 5-year window, he or she is able to escape from his current circumstances and move on from the poverty line. But in order to do that, I'll have to increase my monitoring of that particular thing, which is not permissible, should not be, because there are inherent dangers. What Varad mentioned, it could be extrapolated, it could be extended into little dangerous territories. So how do we go from here to where we're talking about? And that practically is still a steep climb for us.
But before I open it up, I just wanted to add one reflection. And since Mr. Raju is here, it was too tempting not to bring this up. If you look back at the early foundations of the E-Raj, when in the early days of NREGA as well, when the first big, I think it was one of the first largest management information systems that were built around for NREGA through TCS in what was then Andhra Pradesh. There was we also at that point, there were the experimentation with the link between the MIS and the citizen through the social audit process was a very important and critical thing. And in fact, that itself proved to be quite not just a mammoth exercise to unfold and build, but also a process that brought up a whole set of state capacity issues that needed to be built in. And I wonder, and I was just keen to hear just a quick one-liner from all of you before we open it up, whether as we are now getting much more sophisticated about the kinds of technologies and the kinds of platforms, have we stopped focusing, because I'm not seeing the kind of parallel conversation around, how do you make a social audit process more robust, that it then actually leverages the possibilities of technology in a way that is genuinely participatory. And not to say that social audits is the only way to do it or the right way to do it, but just wondering, have we now got so focused on what the new app is or what the new MIS is or how do you link 400 schemes onto DBT, that we're somewhere forgetting how do you create the right kind of platform for citizens to engage with technology in a way that's genuinely meaningful. And all these questions of privacy actually are even more complex now than they were back then. So just a quick, I know it's a big question, but I didn't want us to leave the conversation without touching on this. Just a quick response and then we'll take a few audience questions.
I think it's very important, and I think where we need to do a lot more work than what we have done in the past is on the issue of, whether to call it standardization, protocols of how technology data is stored, used, created, etc. And I think that's an area which is not yet fully worked upon. And that is where will create the kind of contracts between the citizen and the government service provider on what is supposed to happen where. And at the moment, I think these are still evolving because technology is evolving, the systems are evolving, what way technology is delivered, services are delivered. But I think that's an area where we've not done enough work and we will need to do much more work. And I hope that is where a lot of these issues will get covered.
Yeah. I think it's there in a way because all these are, as I said, 10 years old, and the technologies that are being questioned, tested, if you look at it from the ground perspective, it's still relatively new and overwhelming and daunting. But then you have agencies like Umedia Network, you have Gates, the World Bank, they're enabling this process in a very different way. Where they were helping governments earlier, now they're pushing it down to the beneficiary. The questions are coming from their side. So I think the concept in itself of social audit is also undergoing a change along with the technology. And it's not that the transparency or the questioning of that particular transparency has diminished. It's there. It's for us to recognize it and maybe strengthen it further and to empower it further.
Varad, you were at the spearheading all of this. Your comments?
Yeah, no, I think this is sort of what we need, a different way of framing these things. I think, for want of a better word, I think we need some sort of a GovTech innovation unit in government, etc., and tools around it. And I think we need different kinds of people to contribute to it, right? You need the technologists, of course, but you need open source technologists because who think differently in terms of how to build these things and essentially grow the pool of innovators who can engage. but you also need civil society organizations. You also need, obviously, government functioning at different levels. And I think coming up with concepts in that and then trying it out, iterating, piloting is really the way to go, rather than the old style approach of building systems. I think that's where we are landing. There are some good examples, by the way, on where other countries have been trying things like this. I think the UK a few years ago started something like this, and based on that they have developed actually what they're calling government as a platform playbook, where they've actually documented how you should go about building government platforms, where a lot of this thinking on how to involve the citizen, when to involve the citizen is important. We are actually trying to, over the next few months, develop something like that for the Indian context. So if somebody is trying to build a new system in the government, what are the resources across the value chain of building a government system that you can use already, both from global examples and from national examples that can help you get started. But really the idea that divergent, not convergent thinking should be driving the design of a lot of things is really the way forward in my view.
Actually, just 3 points, Yamini. One, I think if you look at the examples of particularly Latin American countries, as they've steadily started using technology to improve delivery, the other thing that they've done is invest in a cadre of social workers at the last mile. And I would contend now, if you look at the composition of the block office or points of contact where citizens interact with the state, what's happening increasingly is you find the computer operator, but the service provider who will help you navigate that system no longer exists. And earlier, perhaps you'd pay a price for it. Now it's being heavily watched because there are CCTV cameras and there are all kinds of other transparency mechanisms, which are good, but who is going to come in and support that activity? So you see, for example, in Brazil, when you go to a municipal office, you'd have obviously, sort of technologists and, people managing data systems, but you also have case managers, frontline workers who are social workers and trained from that background. So that's one. I think invest in the local state, and I think some of these questions will start to answer from there. The second is diversity. I think Bharat just mentioned this. We just organized, you were there, Yamini, I think so were Arun and Dr. Garg. We organized a workshop on systems and using data for social protection programs from IT and finance departments from the states. I was shocked to see that actually there are very few women who are in positions of leadership in these particular departments. And I think that gives you a signal of the kinds of diversity challenges that also come in when you start to think about the design and rollout of technology tools. So the first is invest in the state at the local level through different skill sets. The second is diversity. And the third, of course, is decentralization. I mean, if you look at a lot of the questions that you're asking, honestly, there is no one answer at the India level. It will look very different, in fact, in coastal parts of Odisha versus other parts of Odisha. Do we currently, and I think this goes back to my previous point, which is the hard conversation about how monies flow for these particular programs from the center to the state, which allows state to actually tailor their processes and their programs much more to the local context. Brick and mortar banking may work in certain areas, digital may work in others. There might be tribal areas in Jharkhand where trying to do anything digital through points of contact may be very difficult. Yeah. How do you create that? So I think, those three, I think, are key as you start to think about the parallel conversation to tech.
Thank you, all of you, for such an engaging conversation. And I think we've really touched on a range of critical questions that we need to ask when we think about the challenge of state capacity. And I think we'll be diving deeper into some of these issues in the evening panel, but also engaging much more with these as our research work builds up. We have, I think we can take maybe 4 questions together, and then I'll ask panelists to respond. In keeping with the trend that started with the last panel discussion, younger questions, we will have an age hierarchy. Diversity. So we'll go from younger to older, and I know that a lot of please, now you're going to see what biases I have in determining what's young and not. We'll start with the gentleman there. No, sir, the gentleman in front of you. Sorry.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Rahul. So my question is, when we talk of GovTech, and when we talk that the last mile person should be able to utilize that GovTech, so should the governments, when we talk of technology infusion in government, should the governments be just open to the technology, or should it accelerate the adoption of the technology?
Thanks. Devashish.
Thank you. Yamini, you mentioned about the lack of trust between the citizen and the state. To my mind, in some ways, is this DBT framework and the whole usage of technology also demonstrating a lack of trust between the state and the lower echelons of the state itself? Is there not a trend towards centralization where the frontline functionary is no longer trusted and therefore the authority or the sort of, the decision making is taken away from his hand? Is that the trend, or is there a larger sort of issue around
Sure.
decentralization?
Mr. Raju?
Quite often, the technologies in the government comes from the perspective of administration. The officers who are designing, they bring in their thought process. Rarely one would really look at what is really needed for the poor people, for the people. So, particularly in the context of technologies you are bringing in the welfare sector, is there a paradigm shift in really going and talking to the people, talking to the poor, understanding what exactly they need, and then think of the design?
Thank you. Manish, just if you turn around, the lady behind you, and then there was, I'll take one more question from this side.
Hello. This question is directed more at the government side speakers, and I wonder, in the reference to citizens, if we are forgetting kind of the democratic citizenship angle. So when we talk about bringing in technology and we're looking at the very local, and I would say beyond actually your computer operators, the genes, the young man who's operating your computers, I'm talking about the absolute citizen who has to get services via them. Does the introduction of technology, which relies heavily on very securitized databases, prevent the local state then from being more responsive to the kinds of issues that arise from what Shayana spoke of, very diverse populations within a state, within a district very often, just questions of accountability and transparency, which then come into question when we're talking about securitized databases being used at the very, very local level.
Thanks. And one last question from the gentleman there. Yes.
Thank you. One comment I can make here, rather as a question, is that from what one has heard, that's more like a one-sided dialogue from the government to the citizen. But there is no dialogue from the citizen to the government. And that really is the question to understand the impact of any particular policy intervention. Perhaps one way might be actually to have a platform with machine learning capabilities so that, the assessment of that impact would be available to everybody to see as to whether it's being effective or not. The other aspect of lack of absence of dialogue from the citizen is law and order issues, where the government seems to be often caught unawares if there is a situation brewing and they completely just don't know how to handle. Just one second. In terms of the infrastructure that you've mentioned, I wonder what happens when the internet shut down. To what extent, what happened to the governance at that stage? And you have, of course, Kashmir is a good example of that. Yeah. But maybe I'll stop here.
Thank you. That's an important question. But I see a common thread across these questions, which is really pushing all of you to talk to us a little bit more about the social contract, the relationship between citizens and the state, and what technology is doing to the fundamental experience of citizenship. Arun, if I can start with you, and we'll go this way.
So I don't remember all 5 questions, but the gist of it, somebody said about decentralization versus centralization. So it's, I think, a misunderstanding. Only the processes are being digitized or automated. The process of in fact, this is promoting decentralization. The process of making those decisions still vests in the local authorities that have a relationship with the beneficiary. It's only around the authentication of the beneficiary and the fund transfers where things are being centralized, and in the question of effectiveness, efficiency. And it is helping that. We have enormous data to show that. There was a question around trust and the governance, and whether a voice from this beneficiary to the government, if that would help. Yes. That, I think, is always, as I said, again, it comes back to the question of agency. How much agency do you attribute to the beneficiary, and what procedures can you design around that? So I think that would always be important. I think that's one aspect where successive governments would need to focus on. It's not a overnight kind of a reform, but yes, it is important.
Just a couple of queries. One, whether are we getting more decentralized because of the data, I think that's more of a short-term phenomena, because the first stage would be when when the first stage happens, then there would be centralization, but then in fact, the ability to react would more and more get pushed, like we are pushing it to the district level, it will shift to the block and to the panchayat level. And I think the ability of the front level worker would increase substantially because of the data that person would have to be able to respond. So I think it's a short-term issue, but would move back. Citizens' feedback, in fact, is so much more easier now through social media and through the various portals, and the fact that there are customer service centers across villages now. And of course, mobile is obviously there, which makes it so much easier. So I don't think customer feedback would be an issue. I'm not too sure about that, because in Orissa we have, for example, in the Kalia program, we have 51 lakh beneficiaries. And we've got feedback. We asked people if they have not got some problem or they had a grievance, and 14 lakh grievances we got. And I think that's a pretty big number. So the only two other things I just want to point out is the fact, I think, that we need to recognize that internet has moved in the Maslow's need of hierarchy, perhaps even before food. So in that sense, our objective at the panchayat level is to have three types of systems available at any time. One is through the optic fiber cable, which BSNL has through the BharatNet program. It's more or less universalized. Second is obviously mobile connectivity, which is that. And the third is dish, at least at the headquarter level, because we realized that a lot of services would get affected if internet does get affected. And Orissa, we have cyclones nearly every year, and we've seen it, and we need it. And I think the government's role has to be not a passively to see how tech moves, but to accelerate technology itself. I think that's a very critical part of the food.
Just quickly, I think to the question around citizen feedback, you have many platforms now in the country actually, grievance redress, phone calls, toll numbers. So there's a lot of data, but the question is, do you, as the authority who's supposed to respond, do you have the time, talent, and incentives to do so? And there again, it goes back to the point that you can have a tech tool, but if you don't think about the complementary organizational and human resource reform, you can use the information, but to what end, or will it just sit there and you can't tell signal from noise is unclear. I just wanted to close with one thing, which is, it's a joke, but you do realize most of the IAS in India still is largely engineers, right? And so when you think a little bit about solutions to problems, and I've been in these situations and conversations multiple times, and Dr. Garg is smiling, what tends to happen is it's often time incompatible for a bureaucrat to invest the time in collecting the information from citizens, going through this iterative design process. And again, this is a hard organizational question, which is how do you embed in the bureaucracy systems such that you can actually invest time in building these systems through a user-centric approach, which currently I don't think, given the time and tenure of the way the bureaucratic cycle works, often will function that way. Bharat, last word?
Yeah, the advantage of being last is everything has already been said. But I'll just, maybe to Mr. Raju's point, I think there's a lot of, as people said, there are a lot of feedback mechanisms now, and there the issue is more, is it linked to the business process, etc. But I think there's a lot of thinking now happening on this whole user-centric design, and there's a whole type of professionals who are emerging called human-centric designers, whose really the job is to connect the user's thinking with the design of the product. In the private sector, this is obviously quite common, but I think increasingly in the social space as well, the deploying user-centric professionals. Just to give you one example, something I worked on about a couple of years back when the India Post got its payment bank license. The big question has been, the big dream is that the postman will become the banker at the last mile, essentially, to the most marginalized, because the postman reaches everywhere. But that assumption then needs to be worked on. And we did some work with a set of human-centered designers to actually sit down with postmen from different regions of the country to figure out what would even work for them to be able to clearly, simply articulate a new product concept, say a savings product, to somebody who's been essentially used to saving in their home, under their pillow or in the in the box in which they keep the atta and so on and so forth. So I think moving away from a feedback-oriented world to almost like a user-first design world is what we need to do. And the good news is I think there are now a lot of early thinking which is happening, and I think in the context of so many engineers in the system, that becomes even more important.
Yeah. Thank you on that note. Thank you very much to all of you for what has been a really important and thought-provoking conversation, and look forward to more as we dive deeper into some of these issues.
Thank you.